In a recent video, I shook my rifle by the scope like this violently, shot a .3 MOI group, and concluded that the myth is busted that you can in fact lift your rifle up by the scope. Now, that has been my experience. I've been doing that for years. Is it good? Is it bad? Today, we're going to find out by consulting an industry expert. Mr. Ryan Muckenhern works at Vortex Optics. If you've ever listened to the Vortex Nation podcast, which I highly encourage you to do, he's an absolute wealth of knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the channel, Mr. Ryan Muckenhern. Ryan, so we've spoken about what I did lifting my rifle by the scope. You are the technical expert. I encourage everybody to listen to the Vortex Nation podcast because you're highly knowledgeable when it comes to cartridges and all kind of techie things when it comes to rifles, not so much the other tech as you mentioned. Tell me, how big of a problem is this? My rifle's 20, what did we say, 22 pounds, 20 pounds?
Thereabouts, yeah.
Yeah.
It depends. So understand that when we're subjugating the optic and the rings and the rail and the rifle and all the accoutrement hanging off of it to the forces of recoil, we're putting a lot of strain on those systems. And it's happening very quickly and very violently. And, you know, you as a competitive shooter know that typically once these things are bolted together and they're set at the right torque values and where applicable or necessary, you've got like thread locking compound on there. These things just don't seem to move. You know, you'll go a whole season and really not have to amend your equipment. You'll probably change a barrel before you have to worry about your ring screws for the most part. And so
that's such an American thing to say, by the way. Here in South Africa, our barrels are licensed, so it's a nightmare to change barrels. But anyway,
well,
I digress.
Yeah,
yeah,
we just swap them. It's fine. But no, you probably won't. You probably wouldn't think about your ring screws, your rail screws, your action screws, or anything else during the course of a season because once set, you kind of forget. And the forces that are at work during the recoil sequence and during that recoil impulse are tremendous. And we don't see really scopes migrating under recoil, and we don't see things shifting really under recoil. And so it stands to reason that simply snatching your rifle up by its optic and a short carry is really not going to have a massive negative impact. Now, you present a great question. Well, what if your rifle weighs 22 pounds or more? You know, because it's not atypical to see a full-blown precision rifle series rig, you know, into the 20s, even 30-pound class.
30s, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a couple of parts on a rifle scope that are certainly extremely strong, like the main tube, for instance, and the objective housing and things like this. And then there are parts of the rifle scope that are kind of inherently less strong or weaker. And that would be like the eyepiece. So if you were going to pick your 22-pound rifle up or heavier rifle up by the optic, if you were to grab it by the eyepiece, because that is a separate assembly and separate component from the main tube, you could theoretically institute or install some damage there or do some harm. But that would be...
So we're talking, to clarify here, everything behind the magnification. So not just the little diopter setting here. So if I'm grabbing here, problem.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
And that's simple.
Avoid anything from here on back.
Yeah. And that's simple physics, right? And I wouldn't recommend grabbing it by the turret itself, you know, not that maybe you could unless you had some outstanding pincer strength. But
if you're a rock climber.
Yeah. You know, we have to look at this a couple different ways again. Like I hunt with very lightweight rifles. I don't shoot precision rifle series, but I do a tremendous amount of big game hunting. And like one of my favorite go-to rifles weighs about nominally 6.25 pounds loaded. And I'm putting so much more force onto that optic during the recoil sequence than I am when I pick it up by the optic. And it's not my primary means of carrying the rifle scope. And you had asked a good question earlier is, why do you make it look like a carry handle if it's not supposed to be? And I always think that's kind of funny and clever. But the force that I'm subjugating that optic to on recoil is huge in comparison to that gentle lift. And, you know, I have the fasteners holding the optic to the rings and then the rings to the rifle. And at some point, we must look at this like the rifle is holding the optic up. And so your Gen 3 6-36 that you have on your rifle scope, you know, is in the upper 30s, low 40s for weight. Your rifle is 20 pounds. So if we're holding the optic up that's not so much of a lift as if we're holding the rifle up. And I would imagine that your failure point would actually probably be at the clamp level on the rings themselves pinching onto the Picatinny rail. And whether that was a failure, whether that was a failure at the ring level or whether that was a failure at the rail level or even the fasteners that were holding it in there, that would be my concern. Now, again, this isn't your primary means of transport on the rifle, and you made a awesome video about how you picked your rifle up, and then you went and shot a group with it, and you saw zero deflection of accuracy or your mean group or anything like that. And I think if it's the casual snatch and quick carry over to a barricade, probably no harm, no foul. I don't know that I would recommend porting a 30-pound rifle around by the optic as if it was a carry handle.
Yeah.
But, like I said, as a hunter, oftentimes I'll sit down into a glassing position and I'll have my rifle aside. And then when I get up, I grab it because it is a convenient spot to grab and, put it back in there. And again,
especially if you're going from like prone up, I generally just, as I'm lifting myself up prone, especially in a precision rifle scenario where I'm transitioning from like prone then off some kind of barricade or rock, it's very natural.
Sure. But just like we wouldn't, maybe pick up the rifle by the suppressor, of course it would be hot if you had a suppressor hanging off there. You've got all that leverage extending rearward. And what are we doing to, that shoulder where the suppressor is meeting the barrel, or what are we doing to the threaded stud that's in the barrel, or what are we doing to the internals of the suppressor? Leverage is everything, right? And so where you grab, how you grab is going to dictate whether or not you see success or failure. But the long and short of it is, I don't think it's going to be an immediate detriment to your accuracy or your reliability of the system doing that casual grab, right? Again, I don't think it's a primary anchor point to carry and walk around with your rifle.
It shouldn't be the go-to.
Yeah.
I think what happens is, and at least for me, like I've got relatively small hands, it's obviously difficult to see scale, but especially on the precision rifles, like this is maybe sort of like a hybrid type system, so it's not very wide. And generally our rifles are balanced sort of here just in front of the magazine well, right? So it's very well balanced there. But sometimes what happens, if you're running like MDT Baker wings or something like that, if I'm getting up, it's actually quite difficult for me to wrap my hand around my barrel because of weights and Baker wings. The rifle gets so wide to sit nicely on the bag, so you get the stability from that. But then it becomes sort of awkward to carry, and naturally almost you go here just because you can actually get your hand around it versus, on the gun. So I think it's kind of just like a habit thing.
Oh, certainly.
And I 100% hear what you're saying, like do not make this your go-to, rifle carrying thing. But I just want to circle back to something you said earlier, because that was one of the concerns. I sort of tried to keep up with the comments as this thing sort of spread like wildfire. And guys were saying, you're going to bend the tube. Now you said this is not going to happen, right?
It would take a tremendous amount of force to bend the tube. And one, so it's a cylinder, so it's intrinsically an inherently strong structure. Two, the tube wall thickness, especially of like the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 systems, is very resilient. And you would be amazed at the number of optics that we see come in during especially hunting seasons. And with more and more people getting into things like NRL 22 and PRS, it's become a very accessible sport. And you shoot it, it's a very dynamic sport. You're moving around, you're potentially running into things, and you're kind of throwing your rifle around the course and onto barricades and things like this. We see a lot of, I fell, I dropped, my side-by-side ATV tipped over, my horse reared back. And rifles take hits onto the optic because it's sticking off of the gun. And to see a bent tube, when we do see them, usually something else is horrendously destroyed on the optic. Like if you were to subject the optic to a strike on the eyepiece hard enough to bend the tube at the back, the rest of that eyepiece is completely destroyed. Same thing with the objective. The amount of force required to actually tweak and bend the tube is immense. And it doesn't happen very frequently, but when it does, it's kind of like a non-starter situation for the optic from then on out, right? If you've ever seen a set of the like Leopold standard rings that have a dovetail in the front that you actually rotate the optic into place, there was a lot of folks talking about like, if you rotate the optic into place on the ring and you subject it to that camming force, you'll warp that tube. I've never seen that happen. If it was so galled and bound up that, you had to like lean into it and pull back, maybe, but like that would be an extremely atypical situation to encounter in the first place. And then to actually get it to the point that you bend the tube would be very difficult. You're more likely to see a bend with a drop or a very, very hard and sharp force onto that. That would also probably damage some other things. So
yeah. Back in the day when I just started my channel, I made a video where I took a PST Gen 2 and I threw it on my car window at, I think it was like 45 kilometers per hour, and it like landed on the elevation turret.
Yeah.
It bent the turret. Everything else was fine.
Yeah.
And with some force, I could still zero it, and I was still shooting it out to like 800 yards.
Sure.
And people were amazed by that.
Yeah.
And I've actually got a video that I'm working on with the team to sign off, where we want to do something to a Gen 3 Razor.
Sure.
But we're just, it'll be extreme.
Yeah.
So I'm super excited about that one.
They are remarkably resilient pieces of equipment overall. Yeah.
I wasn't very popular for destroying a scope, but we do it so that other people don't need to.
Sure.
And funny enough, about a month ago, I was busy taking some rifles out, heading to the range. My car door or my truck's doors were open, and I'd like put the rifles into the bags. And my wife parks next to where I park. And when she was driving into our garage, she didn't see that my rifle bags were there, because I'd quickly run back into the studio to like grab my EarPro or something. So she drove over a Gen 3 Razor, okay, and she drove over the eyepiece. And I do think that something actually shifted there, because I actually took it out, shot a match, and then like halfway through the day when I started dialing like a significant amount of wind, like it just wouldn't go back to zero. So I'm going to actually take that out tomorrow and just go diagnose and see what happened there. Is there anything else you wanted to mention that what guys should be doing, shouldn't be doing?
The biggest thing is, and honest to goodness, the number one reason that we see rifle scopes come back to us for, we'll just call it misbehavior or that optic not meeting expectation is mounting solutions. And I cannot overstate enough how important it is to invest in a quality set of mounts. And to follow the torque procedures and guidelines as outlined by your optics manufacturer. And only with rare exception are there mounting solutions that are out there that would otherwise exceed what our torque recommendations are, or for that matter, anybody's torque recommendations within the sport optics community. They are remarkably resilient pieces of equipment. And again, think about the forces that are subjected upon the rifle scope during recoil impulse. And actually, if you look at them under high speed, and probably not on your gun because it's a small caliber, but if you put this on like a 300 Win Mag or a 300 Norma or a 338 Lapua, and you were to fire that rifle and watch it under a high speed, that optic wiggles like a noodle. Really? Yeah, it's crazy. And so good rings at proper torque value and good rings at proper torque value in the right place on the rifle scope saves you a lot of headache and frustration. And I see a number of rifle scopes come back to us every season where you can physically feel and physically see where the rings were mounted and mounted to a force so bad that it's began to crush and compress the tube. And that still is one of our biggest contributors to rifle scope failure in the field, or like I said, general misbehavior where you're running into tracking issues or you're running into, scopes that have a side parallax function. You go to manipulate your parallax wheel and there's a lens forward of your turret housing that is translating fore and aft, and it encounters that point where the tube has drawn down under the load of the ring, and that lens or the housing that the lens is held in encounters the same resistance, and then you have deflection or you have total bind and it doesn't function. Invest in quality rings, follow torque procedures, and really, if done properly, this is not something that you need to be constantly checking or worried about creating a failure point. Many of my rifles that I hunt with, I mounted the scopes on them years ago, and I do a cursory check before I hit the field to make sure that my zero is there, and really it's never changed, and I attribute that.
And you're using like blue thread locker or something?
Nothing on the ring screws themselves, so nothing that's
okay.
So we have to be careful about ring torque. We'll break ring torque into two parts. We have what we call a dry torque and a wet torque, and then you have components like the ring cap screws themselves. We don't want to Loctite those into place, because that will induce what's called a wet torque, and you actually end up with a bit more clamping force than you would with a dry torque. So think of that Loctite as you would a lubricant in its liquid form. Your torque wrench is a dumb tool. It doesn't know that it's a wet or a dry torque. All it's doing is waiting for resistance until it cams over. And if we lubricate the thread, or we lubricate the receptacle that the thread is driving into, you can get that fastener deeper into that receptacle, ergo introducing more clamp force at the ring level. And you're not introducing more torque per se, because 16 inch-pounds is 16 inch-pounds, or 18 inch-pounds is 18 inch-pounds, or Newton meters, or whatever you're torquing to.
Yeah, we're doing the same as you. Yeah.
But you're allowing that fastener to go deeper into the receptacle and apply more clamp force before encountering that resistance, and you end up inducing the same failure as you would if you were running to, say, 22, 25, 28 inch-pounds on components that...
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because I'm doing that, by the way. I have blue thread locker on everything, and then I torque to like 15 inch-pounds.
So with the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 systems, understand that the tube wall thickness is considerably greater than that of, say, like I hunt with the Viper HS 2.5 to 10 on most of my rifles. I think I have 16 of them now. If you were to cross-section that rifle scope and you were to measure the tube wall thickness, the Gen 2 and Gen 3 is notably heavier. And in part, that's where the heft of that optical system comes from. A lot of glass and a lot of brass and steel in there as well. But the tube wall thicknesses are greater, and they are more tolerant to torque. So considering your use case, you're kind of a Formula One driver with this system. It's not a terrible idea, and that particular optical and mechanical system, you can get away with it. If you are adamant about using thread locking compound on the ring screws themselves, lower your torque value, because you will drive, and you said you were at 15 inch-pounds? Yeah, you will drive that fastener deeper into the receptacle compared to like a dry torque, and by lowering your torque poundage, you're saving face and saving grace on that. On very lightweight and delicate hunting rifle scopes, this is a little bit of a riskier proposition, and it can be a bit more difficult to understand how much, like what level of exacerbation are we putting on that fastener from like a torque perspective. So it's a little riskier to do. Something that I have done in the past, not with rifle scopes, but on a similar vein. I shoot some black powder cartridge rifles, and they have these delicate sights on the back side of the rifle, like a flip-up Sewell type sight or a veneer type sight. I will use clear nail polish to anchor the fasteners and the screws on the sight so that they don't walk under the duress of recoil. And these sights, I manipulate them quite a bit. They fold, and then I flip them back up, and they're long, so they've got a long leverage arm there. And they get banged around quite a bit. You could do the same thing with your rifle scope screws on your ring caps, in which after you've achieved your torque sequence, a drop of that clear nail polish on there is going to create a physical barrier and a bond to prevent the screw from walking out under the duress of recoil and vibration. Of course, a bit inconvenient to amend it. If you needed to, you'd have to get some acetone out and dissolve that, and then you can break the screw loose. And there are some other chemical agents that don't have the same lubricating properties that Loctite would in their application. And there's even what's called a dry patch. So if you buy a set of Leopold rings, and this is everything above their rifleman line, so mostly for hunters, but if you get into like their standard ring systems or QRW, PRWs, and some others, they put a small dry patch, and it looks like dried blue Loctite. It's a different compound, but it's doing the same thing. And that is also okay, because we're not introducing a lubricating component to that equation, and that's fine. Like I said, for you and for other PRS competitors that are running these very heavy-duty military-grade rifle scopes that do have very, very thick sidewalls to their main tubes, and then the level of quality that you have on your ring systems and the concentricity and how they match up to that tube, you're unlikely to induce any kind of failure with that. Moving down the ring and we get to like the ring clamp and then the Picatinny rail and then the base screws that are anchoring to the rifle and then your action screws that are holding your rifle's action to your stock. These are definitely points where it is absolutely fine to use a thread locking compound. I typically won't on the clamp screws, and maybe that's out of habit, but if I want to amend the placement of the rifle scope on that Picatinny rail, it's somewhat inconvenient to have a locking compound on there, unless you just set it and forget it and say, hey, I'm never going to move the position of the rifle scope fore or aft on the rail. Base screws to action, 100%. Action screws to receiver, 100%. These are often overlooked points of failure on rifle systems. And I think we every day get a lot of calls on folks that are having accuracy issues, that when we start going through the troubleshooting process and unpacking, what's happening.
Something's loose.
And it's typically like an action screw or a base screw. Same thing with muzzle devices.
It's my go-to. If your rifle was shooting and you changed nothing and it's not shooting anymore, something is probably loose. And that's what we're sort of sometimes spoiled with in the custom gun. This is a BAT TR, so the scope base is machined into the action. So that's one less thing that can come loose. But in South Africa, because of affordability and the difficulty of getting components, Howa rifles are very popular here. So a lot of guys shoot Howas, and I always do a little systems check, like you mentioned earlier. Before I take any rifle out, I check every single screw on the rifle. It's almost like a pre-flight type of thing, because I don't want to get to the middle of nowhere, something's loose, And the danger is you got to take your scope off to check those on a Howa, and guys don't do that. Now you get to a match, you egg your first stage, and you have a horrible day. You could have saved yourself that by just taking your optic off, doing 4 little screws at 15 or whatever the torque spec is there, and you're off to the races.
And that's a great point. The pre-flight checklist is a really good thing to do. I do it prior to season, and usually I'm doing a tear down. I'm not a big bore cleaner, and that's a whole nother conversation. But when I reassemble very, very much the same way every time, and with judicious attention to torque, fastener placement, recoil lug placement, and all these things. And once I set it, then I'm happy and confident for the rest of the season. So.
Yeah, consistency is key with this long-range thing. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for being a wealth of knowledge. I really appreciate you taking the time to educate us. I'm going to now immediately loosen all my LHT rings.
Sure.
One thing that I really like you guys doing on the new Pro Series rings is that you're actually engraving the torque spec on the rings, not just on the caps, but also where they go onto the action. I just wish people would read those. And
they do. And honestly, when I started at Vortex many years ago, a lot of the conversations that would come into the phone and email, we would be chasing ring torque and found that, amending that ring torque and being very vocal and upfront about the importance of it solved most of the problems. And so we became very proactive with it. If you buy a new Vortex scope, regardless of whether it's a Crossfire or a Gen 3, and you open the box, there's a little tag in there that'll tell you about ring torque. And then, like you said, on the Pro Series rings, it was an idea that we had, and said, let's do it. I think it has mitigated the number of calls that have come in. Yeah, and I think it saved a lot of hunts, and I think it saved a lot of range days, and made more people happy than sad. So it's yes, definitely. We're happy to do that, and we'll continue to lean into that for sure. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Ryan, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure having you. And guys, thanks for watching. Make sure you check out Ryan and the team at the Vortex Nation podcast too. And thanks for watching. Bye.